How easily manipulated are you? How gullible are you to propaganda? Now, if you're like most people, myself included, you'll say, well, I'm not easily manipulated at all. I'm certainly not gullible and I don't listen to propaganda. But do you know, we all like to think that. We think we're sophisticated. But all of us are manipulated on a constant basis, and very few really realize it. In fact, through all history, people have been maneuvered into feeling a certain way, acting a certain way, taking a certain side. Now, how would you like to get an insight into the dark levers of power? How envy, lust for power, revenge, ambition triumph through all history over noble ideas and even noble people who wish to rule for the benefit of others. This video, you're going to get a remarkable insight from a place you likely do not expect it to come from. And when I say where it's from, don't skip this video. Do yourself a favour, because you may just learn something really eye-opening. This video is about the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare. Don't skip on if you think that has no relevance at all. Shakespeare had a gift bordering on the miraculous of being able to strip away all the facades of characters and to understand and put across the innermost motives of people so that we could see them if we really listen. Now, I want to tell you how this video is going to go and a couple of things about it. First of all, it's specifically designed for people at high school or college. You know, you may have exams coming up on Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And so I want to address a few things there and how it's important to understand the play as a whole. But secondly, even if you're not at high school or college, to understand just how brilliant the plays are of Shakespeare, and not because I personally like them, just how much insight can be gained through literature, and that actually a lot of us not reading literature is the reason we're so easily manipulated. So, having said that, let's dig into the play Julius Caesar. The play Julius Caesar was written by Shakespeare 400 years ago. And sometimes we think, well, that means it's old news and it's got no relevance to us today. Well, it still remained popular and very, very relevant. In fact, forget about just studying Julius Caesar to get a grade in an exam. Look at Julius Caesar, understand it, and your eyes will be opened to the world you live in now. And I genuinely mean that. You will see how the levers of power work. How dark, ugly and backbiting a lot of people in the top echelons of power actually are. And how the noble-minded, those who truly want to help, are often swerved into the wrong lane in order to cause damage. And how many things that are said that sound lovely are only being used to manipulate you and me and everybody else. Because Julius Caesar the play is not just a story that's set in Rome around Julius Caesar and his chums. It's far, far more than that. Shakespeare gets at what is inside a human, and that has never changed. This play is about power, personality, and persuasion. We're going to take a look at Julius Caesar and the four main characters around him in this play and see how they interrelate. But this is the key, especially if you're studying this for high school or college. My college instructor once said to me, your grade doesn't depend on memorizing the right answers or memorizing the correct quotes. Your grade depends on you understanding what you're reading, drawing a conclusion from it for yourself and being able to support that conclusion. And the more insightful you are, the more impressed the person marking your exam will be. So we just want to understand what this play is truly about. And the best way you can get this, and even if you're not at high school or college, is to ask the question, how is today like back then? And what was Shakespeare really exposing, which still fits today? Because that's what Shakespeare was good at. He got at the kernel of truth, the nub, the crux, the central issue, the driving motivation behind human beings that has not changed from ancient Egypt to ancient Rome to the medieval age to the present day, right to 2024. What I want to do before we start is we just have to separate out history and the play. This is a vital thing to understand. So let's just quickly talk about some actual history. Going back to the BC days, Julius Caesar, as you know, was a real figure. He was the first emperor of the Roman Empire. He grew up as part of one of the noble families. He became a general, succeeded so well that he eventually got the power to become dictator, which would later be called Caesar in his image. Was he a purely good man, a noble and brilliant Roman upright person? No, of course he wasn't. The truth is that Caesar was very ambitious. Caesar wasn't particularly pleasant at times. He perpetrated some awful acts, and he was very arrogant. Anyone that wants to actually be the dictator over the entire world must have a certain amount of arrogance about them. Let's look at Cassius. Cassius, who plays a big role in the play, a real Roman senator, but more than that, he was a general himself for Rome. He performed in very high positions of influence within the Roman government itself. He was an enemy of Caesar and actually fought against him along with the general Pompey, but was beaten by Caesar. Pretty much had a feud and had it in for him, and he was one of the conspirators that, chief conspirators that put Caesar to death in the Ides of March. Brutus, a real senator, actually quite well reported on in history as a rule of thumb. But was he perfectly pure and innocent? No, of course not. No one is that pure and innocent. And with the amount of conniving, backstabbing, killing and infighting that took place in ancient Rome, you can't say any one of them was going to be all good. And then you have Mark Antony. Mark Antony, a great figure in Roman history, actually had a relationship with the famous Egyptian queen Cleopatra, and came within a whisker himself of being the next emperor after Julius Caesar. He too was a great general, an extraordinary politician who could play people off against each other, and a conniving so-and-so. So in the whole scheme of things, they're all multifaceted personalities. They're not purely good or bad. However, let's come to the play. Julius Caesar, as a play, uses those characters to represent certain types of people. Shakespeare has to simplify the play because he wants to get across a message about power. He wants to demonstrate what actually goes on in, the back halls of governments and power, and how people vie for positions. And he strips bare, using different characters, he strips bare qualities and how they are used in politics, and how people strive to get power for themselves. In this play especially, he wants to focus on how the noble thing, the thing that should be esteemed, the great ideal, is held up, and either it's undermined by those who truly believe it are undermined for those who want power, or it's used as a way to convince the masses to give someone else power. And so, in this play, we're going to take a look at the central figure of Julius Caesar, who is not the main figure of the play, funnily enough. We're going to take a look at Cassius, Brutus, Mark Antony, and the plebs. As we look at these, if you want to understand this play, all the time think, how does this happen today? Because that was what Shakespeare is after. And when we understand that, we understand an awful lot about life, and you're also in a great position to make your own judgments on the play and be able to back up your thoughts in an exam. So the first person to take a look at in the play is Julius Caesar himself, who, as I've said, is not the main character. We'll come to the main character soon. Julius Caesar, as we've said in history, was by no means a saint. You know, he was ambitious and arrogant and everything, but he isn't in the play. Some of his quotes, you could say, demonstrate a certain arrogance, but it's more a self-confidence that he has in the play. We still feel, in some respects, that Caesar is hard done by and that we wish he had actually been given the crown. Because he is very noble in the play. He has a great stature. And Shakespeare practically turns Julius Caesar into Rome, the perfect ideal. He will stand for Rome. He makes Rome great. He represents the people. He is the people's favourite. There's a quote that Caesar makes. He only has 150 lines in the whole play, and he dies halfway through, which is crazy for a character who the play is named after. We're looking at Act 3, Scene 1. And this is something that Caesar says. This is before he's killed, when the conspirators come to stab him and they want him to change his ways. They want him to bring back someone he exiled called Simba. Caesar says, "I could be well moved if I were as you. If I could pray to move, prayers would move me. But I am constant as the northern star, of whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament. The skies are painted with unnumbered sparks, they are all fire, and every one doth shine, but there's but one in all doth hold his place. So in the world 'tis furnished well with men, and men are flesh and blood and apprehensive. Yet in the number I do know but one that unassailable holds on his rank, unshaped of motion, and that I am he. Let me show it, even in this, that I was constant, Simba should be banished, and constant do remain to keep him so." This statement sums up Julius Caesar. He is the ideal. He stands and has done everything for Rome, and he is constant. He's not a politician. He's not purely trying to twist things for his own advantage. He knows what is right for Rome, and he will not bend as the others around him do. They politic. You know, they chop and change their message in order to get ahead in power. And because he's this immovable character, even faced with death, he won't change. He says other things about himself, such as men die many deaths, but he only dies one, because death has to come to us all, so why be worried about it? You know, he is the epitome of Roman bravery, of everything the Roman public esteemed in a person. And Shakespeare wants us to see him that way. He is the ideal, the perfect ideal to live up to, the embodiment of the right ideal of Rome. And it's vital to remember that. Now, to help us not see him as some aloof, arrogant god, and totally arrogant, which would put us off, through the play, he's given weaknesses. For instance, Cassius early on talks about how he saved Caesar from drowning while swimming the Tiber River. We also learn that Caesar has epilepsy because he drops to the floor and foams at the mouth when the people keep trying to make him king. We also hear that he's deaf in one ear. Excuse the pun, because he says to Mark Antony, "Come to my left because I'm deaf in my right ear." So Shakespeare places some weaknesses on Julius Caesar in order to make him human, but he's got a valiant spirit, a spirit that embodies all that is good about Rome. Was that the real Caesar? No. Was he viewed as ambitious by the others? Yes. Did people of Shakespeare's day know that Caesar had ambition? Yes, they did. You had Plutarch, who had been translated into English. It's the history of the Romans. And they knew that. So there's an ambition, but we get a sense of him being justified by Shakespeare because he is the most upright amongst them all. Why would Shakespeare make this character like this? Probably for two reasons. One, it carries a good central pole or motif around which the others will operate, but also because he had to be careful in his own day of saying anything against the ruling powers, the Queen particularly. And so by leaving Caesar as rightfully someone who should have been given the crown, and as someone who was the ideal, he's supporting the idea that the person who is king or queen, they are automatically noble and virtuous and shouldn't be messed with, and no one should seek to undermine them. So he recognises that he has to be cautious, because back then playwrights could be put in prison or even executed for what they, if it was deemed their plays were subversive to the monarch. So that's one of the reasons. And by the way, although he dies in Act 3, there's something very important about Julius Caesar, the ideal, and that he does come off the victor in the end. And we'll see that later in this video. So that's Julius Caesar. Think of him as the embodiment of Rome, of what people think Rome is meant to be. It is great. It is grand. You know, it's brilliant. Julius Caesar is that. He is the North Star, fixed in position while all others move and sway with motion. Although Julius Caesar is the ideal of Rome itself, that representation of what Rome could be and how great it is, he is not really the story. The story is about the power struggle around him to remove him for people's various ends. There are 4 characters in the play that orbit this idea of Rome. And they are Cassius, Brutus, Mark Antony, and the plebs being the common people, who seem to play a bit part role, but are very, very important. We're going to start by looking at Cassius and what motivates him. So let's talk about Cassius. Cassius was the leader of the conspirators who would murder Julius Caesar, and he was Julius Caesar's implacable foe, you know, an absolute arch nemesis. And in history, that's quite true. But in the play, the motivations for Cassius hating Caesar are envy and a greed for power. He will talk about how Julius Caesar is a threat to Rome, how he's going to be a tyrant if he's king, that we need to keep the Senate. Now, that sounds noble, but in the play, Cassius is only using it as a lip service. He's saying it because it sounds good and it justifies why he can get rid of Julius Caesar as an enemy so that he can be more powerful. You see, Cassius is pretty much the most dominant force in the Senate if it wasn't for Julius Caesar. So his motive for killing Caesar isn't for the benefit of Rome. It's because he wants to be the most powerful man in Rome. If you're writing an essay, something you may want to remember and even do some further reading on is in this play, Shakespeare seems to be first developing the idea of envy as a main quality in a character that will come out in the later tragedy Othello with Iago. Iago is, you know, the epitome of envy and manipulation. And we sort of get the seeds of that character in Cassius in the histories. But just take a look at some of the snippets from the play about Cassius. This is Cassius talking now in Act 1, Scene 2 to Brutus, trying to get Brutus to see that Julius Caesar is a threat. He's too powerful. He's going to be a tyrant. Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonourable graves. Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Now, Cassius is very, very persuasive. Remember, this play is about persuasion as well. Cassius is not the great speaker, but he is an extremely effective politician. When he's got the ear of someone, he knows how to sow seeds of doubt, which is what Iago does later in the play Othello. But this little section tells us how Cassius feels. He is envious of Julius Caesar because of his position and reputation. Julius Caesar, he says, is like a colossus. A colossus was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was a giant statue on the harbour of Rhodes, an island. and the ships were supposedly sail between his legs. This statue was so big. He's saying Julius Caesar is a colossus and we walk under his legs and peep about. He hates the fact that he is noble, thinks a lot of himself, but is dwarfed by Caesar's personality. Cassius hates that. And this is envy, not jealousy. Jealousy is when you want something that somebody else has. Envy is worse. Envy that Cassius has is when you want what someone else has and you don't want them to have it. Okay, so it's not a case of, oh, we can both have something. It's not only do I want what you've got, I also want you to lose what you've got. He is a very nasty character in this play. And all of that envy is driven towards the assassination of Julius Caesar. Now, looking at something more about Cassius as a character is that he is a great manipulator and he's a shadowy figure who's conniving. Julius Caesar knows this about Cassius. In fact, Julius Caesar speaks about Cassius to Mark Antony. And this is what he says. We're in Act 1, Scene 2 still. Yond Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. But I fear him not. Yet if my name were liable to fear, I do not know the man I should avoid so soon as that spare Cassius. He reads much. He is a great observer, and he looks quite through the deeds of men. Such men as he be never at heart's ease, whilst they behold a greater than themselves, and therefore are they very dangerous. So that was Julius Caesar talking to Mark Antony. He says of Cassius that he will not be at ease while there is a person who is greater than them. They are envious and they will do anything to bring another person down so that they can be the most prominent. It shows that Cassius is full of ambition, which is the quality that they charge Caesar with and say they kill Caesar because of ambition. What is Shakespeare saying? He's actually saying, wake up, in the halls of power, it's not all noble people doing what's good for the benefit of everyone. But the movement of power is based on ambition and greed and envy and hating other people who have more power than you. That's a very self-centered world. And Shakespeare's saying that's what goes on in the halls of power. And that this person cares not, Cassius cares not about the ideal of Rome and what is best for Rome, which ultimately is Caesar in this book, but rather he would bring down Rome in order that he could be the most powerful character. Now we move on to the main character of the whole play, Brutus himself. Like I say, this book or play should have been called The Tragedy of Noble Brutus. Obviously in history no one is purely innocent and purely noble, but in a play Brutus stands for those people who do go into office in order to serve and do what is good for the majority. What Brutus demonstrates through Shakespeare is that those people are few and far between, and that unfortunately they can get manipulated by those with nefarious goals and ambitions like Cassius. Brutus is noble. At the end of the play, Mark Antony will say that he was the most noble of all the Romans. Brutus believes in Rome as an ideal. Brutus believes in the way it's structured and its greatness and its people. Now, this is interesting because who's his best friend? Julius Caesar. Who loves Brutus the most? Julius Caesar. And who loves Julius Caesar the most? Brutus. Mark Antony loves him, but Brutus more so. Thinking of Julius Caesar as the ideal of Rome itself and everything good that stands about the Roman ideal, it's interesting that Brutus would love Julius Caesar because that's what Brutus loves the most. It's Rome. He is noble and upright, and all of his ideas are geared to the benefit of Rome and its people. This is what's so interesting about this play, because I'm going to give you a word which is very useful to understand when reading all of the tragedies of Shakespeare, and if you can include it in an exam, this would be great. Nobility, the quality, is Brutus' hamartia. Hamartia means the quality, the good quality, that ultimately leads to your downfall. You wouldn't think nobility could lead to someone's crash. But we see with Brutus, his noble mind is so innocent that it's able to be persuaded against the person who stands best for Rome. He turns and kills Caesar with Cassius and the rest of the conspirators because he's so noble. Now, how do we know that? Well, Act 2, Scene 1, right at the beginning. This is when Brutus is talking about the need for Caesar to die. But look what he says. It must be by his death. And for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. Do you understand what Brutus is saying here? He has no animosity against Caesar. He's saying personally, he's never done any wrong to me. In fact, he's always been good to me. But still, he must die for the general good, for the good of Rome, because he could be a tyrant if he becomes king. Now, how does Brutus come to that conclusion? Because he is noble and he is fair-minded. It's because Cassius has carefully poured poison into his ear, talking about, if you read the bit where he talks about Julius Caesar as a colossus, he goes further on and really gets Brutus thinking about what would happen if Caesar is so loved and popular that they actually make him king. In Brutus' mind, that's a bad thing because he believes in the Roman Republic and the idea that kings are bad in Rome's history. In fact, Brutus' own ancestor was the one who killed the last king of Rome, Tarquin. Why does Brutus get to this position? Even though he's never been offended by Caesar or crossed by Caesar himself, why does he believe there's a problem? Well, he goes on to talk about what can happen when someone is good, but they climb too high to the point they become so arrogant they despise all that they've got power over. He says this, and it's very interesting. Fashion it thus, that what he is augmented would run to these and these extremities, and therefore think him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would, as his kind, grow mischievous, and kill him in his shell. Right, let's just explain that. I want you to really understand it and read that through. Fashion it thus, imagine. So there's no evidence to say that Julius Caesar is going to be a tyrant, except that he's becoming popular and it looks like the crowd will make him a king. And Brutus says, well, potentially, someone that gets that power, they may be really, really good, but potentially they might turn into someone who actually gets really arrogant and full of themselves, and now they do damage to the people below them. Then he says, fashion it thus. Imagine if that happens. And he says, then it's better that we think of him as a serpent's egg. If you let the serpent's egg grow and hatch, it then grows into a full serpent which can bite, poison and kill you. And he says, so if you imagine what potentially Caesar could do if he becomes king, it's better that we smash him while he's in the egg rather than let him turn into a poisonous snake. So actually Brutus bases his judgment on fear, on what could be. And where did he get that idea from? He got it from Cassius and the conspirators. But at the same time, you can understand why Brutus does what he does. Because it is true, Julius Caesar, given all power as a dictator, could be negative to Rome, could look down on them, could start abusing them and being a tyrant. And so based upon that, Brutus acts. Do you see, his motive is noble. He wants to protect Rome. And in purely human terms, you could think he was right. But in the play, he's made a grave mistake. Because in the play, Julius Caesar stands for the ideal of Rome. Julius Caesar has done no wrong. Julius Caesar seems that he will always be for the people. In fact, later on we learn that in his will he's left money to the plebs to build them parks and gardens and everything like that. So the ideal of Julius Caesar is noble. And Brutus, out of fear and worry put into his mind by the envious Cassius, has taken a step to try and protect Rome. But it's actually in error. And remember, Julius Caesar, you couldn't really go against him in the play because the monarch would look at Julius Caesar in this play and think of themselves. So you can't have the Julius Caesar actually being found out to be a terrible person because the king or queen of the day would think, oh, what are you saying about me? But we understand Brutus has been manipulated. His nobility, his goodness has been manipulated in order to achieve Cassius' ends, which are envious. What's Shakespeare saying, and what do we see today? People go into power, areas of influence, because they might agree with the ideal of something, the ideal of democracy, for argument's sake. And they may want to do what's good for the people. But Brutus, his naivety and determination to do what is best for the people, is turned to actually do something that is bad for the people, even though it's in good intent. The connivers and the politicers, they are the ones who will bend even the good to their will to get what they want. Do you see what Shakespeare's saying? Now, if you look through history and even today, the same thing exists. Backroom deals, all sorts of shady goings on, backbiting, stabbing, groups forming against each other. And there's some people in the middle who want to do what's good, but are forced to take sides and lose their nobility. To demonstrate Brutus' nobility and that he is not just trying to kill for the purpose of raising his own profile, there is an interesting conversation between Cassius and Brutus towards the end of Act 2, Scene 1, where Cassius wants to kill Mark Antony as well as Caesar. Because Mark Antony is not on the side of Cassius and the conspirators. Now, Mark Antony is powerful, he's a good speaker, and he has potential to become powerful in the Senate. Not yet, though. He's growing in power because of his relation to Caesar. Listen to what Cassius says to highlight his envy and his real motive, and then listen to Brutus' response to show Brutus' nobility. I think it is not meet Mark Antony, so well beloved of Caesar, should outlive Caesar. We shall find of him a shrewd contriver, and you know his means, if he improve them, may well stretch so far as to annoy us all, which to prevent, let Antony and Caesar fall together. Do you see what Cassius is saying? We need to kill Mark Antony along with Caesar, because if Caesar dies, Mark Antony, if he manages to grow his power even more, he will use this to come after us. Cassius wants to remove all obstacles to his strength. He's envious, and he will kill to get there. But what does Brutus say? Our course will seem too bloody, Caius Cassius, to cut the head off and then hack the limbs like wrath in death and envy afterwards. For Antony is but a limb of Caesar. Let us be sacrificers, but not butchers, Caius. Do you see Brutus' response? He's shocked that Cassius wants to kill Mark Antony because Brutus' motive for joining the conspirators to kill Caesar is to protect Rome. Cassius wants to get power for himself, and Brutus says, no, we don't just kill Caesar and then go killing all of our opponents. We're not butchers. We're sacrificers. In other words, priests to the gods of Rome. We're killing Caesar as a sacrifice to the Roman Republic. But to kill Mark Antony is a purge. That's just, brutal and bloody and self-serving. And so this little conversation demonstrates that Brutus' motive is pure, even though he's going to kill Caesar, whom he loves. A final comment about Brutus is his great speech at Caesar's funeral. Now, it's not as powerful as Mark Antony's, and that's because Brutus uses facts and logic to explain why he joined the conspirators and why Caesar had to die. Facts and logic and the noble motive. And in that he says this: "If there be any in this assembly, any dear friend of Caesar's, to him I say that Brutus' love to Caesar was no less than his. If then that friend demand why Brutus rose against Caesar, this is my answer. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more." And there we get the noble Brutus. He's killed Caesar because he wants to do the right thing by Rome. It's his hamartia. This will lead to Brutus' downfall, but he did it for the right reason. So that's Brutus, the central character in this play. This is a tragedy because we have a man who loves Rome. He loves Caesar. He does good to people. He wants to serve the public of Rome. He believes in the ideal of the Roman Senate. And envious, conniving, dark-hearted people use that nobility because he's the best friend of Caesar as the means to bring Caesar down. And that's the tragedy with Brutus. But a tragedy will always end in death, and we'll come to that soon. But first, let's look at Mark Antony. Mark Antony is most famous in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar because of the incredible speech he gives, which is a lesson in manipulation. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not praise him." Now, Mark Antony is not actually the greatest character in the play. Shakespeare couldn't develop him fully and would later develop him better in Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the romance. But Mark Antony also plays a role in things. Overall, we like Mark Antony because he defends Caesar. However, he's not without a certain dark side himself. He is quite ambitious for power. He is with Caesar, yes, because he loves him, but also because Caesar will get him through the Senate and will raise his power. Mark Antony can't do it without Caesar. And in Caesar's death, he sees the opportunity to become powerful. And he uses that brilliant speech in order to do it. But the speech is framed specifically around using Caesar as the ideal in order to bring Mark Antony to the top. And this is exploitative. I want you to think about today. How many politicians will make promises, particularly in campaigns, before voting? They'll promise many great things and they'll talk about hope. They'll talk about change. They'll talk about unity. They'll say, yes, we can. All high-sounding ideals which people take up, but end up turning to thin air. What actually changes? Have people ever got to a government where they're like, hey, they've finally given us a real hope. They finally brought real change. No, but to get people to buy into it, it's as old as time that people trying to get power will promise wonderful things. They will appeal to the noble ideals in order to get voted for or placed in power. Mark Antony does the same thing. It's basically, you see it in his Friends, Romans, Countrymen speech and the first part of it. And for that, I recommend you go and see my line-by-line explanation, because I'm not going to do that here. Line-by-line explanation of just how Mark Antony manipulates the crowd. The crowd have heard why Brutus put Caesar to death. Brutus' speech is not as good as Mark Antony's because he focuses on logic. He focuses on the facts that Caesar had to die lest he be a threat to the Republic. Mark Antony plays all of the emotions. And by doing so, he gains the popularity of the people. He says all sorts of things. One of the things he says is he uses a truth and spins it into a lie. Brutus was a noble man. Or Brutus is a noble man. And Brutus is noble. We've just seen that. But Mark Antony then starts describing good things that Caesar did. Didn't Caesar reject the crown 3 times? You saw me offer it him and he rejected it 3 times. You know, that doesn't seem like ambition, but Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is a noble man. And in his will, he left you all this money. But he was, does that sound like ambition? But Brutus said he was ambitious, and Brutus is a noble man. Do you see, it's the power of insinuation. He also performs or affects emotion. In his speech, he says, "You all did love him," Julius Caesar, "once, not without cause. What cause withhold you then to mourn for him?" Because instead of being upset at Caesar's death, the plebs are rejoicing because they realise Brutus has saved them from a tyrant. Now Mark Antony says, "You loved him when he was alive. Why are you not weeping over him now?" Then he says, "O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason." And then he says, "Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me." Let's just explain what that means, because it's really powerful. He's saying, you loved him. He's rejected the crown. He's given money to everybody. You loved him when he was alive, and now you're suddenly rejoicing that he's dead because Brutus is a noble man. And then he says, "O judgment, O reason, you're fled to brutish beasts." Oh, where is the thinking in this? You're as unthinking as animals. Very clever use. You're fled to brutish beasts. What does that sound like? Brutus. He's insinuating that Brutus and the conspirators connive to get Caesar killed for their own ambition. And he's right. Casca and Cassius and the lot, they did, but not Brutus. But he has to remove Brutus out of the picture because people know Brutus is noble. So he has to insinuate that Brutus isn't. And then, do you notice how he plays on their emotions? He says, "Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar. I'm dead with Caesar. My heart is with him." And he bursts into tears. And the crowd go, "Oh dear, look how much he loves Caesar. Caesar was actually noble. The conspirators have done a terrible thing." What? And they turn. Now what's so interesting is right at the end of the speech, the plebs run off to get the conspirators and kill them. And this is what Antony says. When all the citizens leave with Caesar's body and he's left on the stage alone, he says to the audience, "Now let it work. Mischief thou art afoot. Take thou what course thou wilt." In other words, now let it work. I've swayed them. Mischief, or bad events, because he knows they're going to go and kill a load of senators, just go and work what you will. And that tells us the callous conniving of Mark Antony. He's getting power by appealing to the ideal of Rome, which was represented in Caesar. So high-sounding words, high-looking emotions, but for a self-serving reason. Now, here's the thing about the other character, which is the plebs. Not a great deal said about the plebs, but they are so important to you and me and understanding the play. In the play, we might put ourselves in the position of Brutus, or we may feel the grandeur and speech and aura of Mark Antony, or we may identify with Julius Caesar being this fixed representative, this upright person. We won't put ourselves in Cassius' place because we don't think of ourselves as baddies. We are the plebs. The plebs in this book move back and forward. When Caesar dies, the plebs are up in arms. They love Caesar and they're going to kill the conspirators. Brutus speaks to them and suddenly, wow, the conspirators are the best thing ever. And they're so right. And when Mark Antony turns up, some of them want to kill Mark Antony because he's friends with Caesar. And they think, oh, he's going to defend Caesar and that Caesar was good. Well, we know he's not because we listened to Brutus and that was very persuasive. And then Mark Antony says, "Lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not praise him." Well, that was a lie. He knew what he would come for. He'd come to turn their minds around. And then he slowly changes them. And what happens at the end of Mark Antony's speech? The plebs are suddenly on Julius Caesar's side again and off killing the conspirators. How easily moved we are. Think of today. Again, when campaigning, or when trying to get people to buy into something, whether it's political or even through advertising or whatever for money reasons, people phrase things in a certain way that moves us. And we move by just the sound of their message. And the empty words we don't notice. We just hear what sounds lovely and go with it. Do you know, believe me, the majority of people watching this video are like that. I'm like that. Things sway us unless we step back and break something down. We'll be moved by just clever speech and emotional speech and the like. We're the plebs. Shakespeare's saying, wake up, people. Those in charge are pretty much manipulating things for their own ends. And those who are genuinely noble, they end up getting crushed under the ugliness, darkness and filth that is in the corridors of power. And that's what this play is about. Shakespeare strips away the facade and shows us what is in the hearts of men. Envy, lust for power, a need for revenge. That's something about Mark Antony. He wants vengeance. He did love Julius Caesar. He wants to kill those who killed him. But he also wants power, comes within a whisker of it as well. That's really what's going on. And the noble and the noble ideal are only courted by these ones in order to bring themselves power. They're not interested. But for the majority of people on the outside, they look and think, well, people are doing things for the right reason. Shakespeare's saying that's not in the hearts of men. Now, if you look through all of history, you'll find exactly that across the world. Name a government that has ever got rid of homelessness, poverty, food shortage, that's ever been truly fair to everybody. Would you say it's arguably within all of their power? And yet most of it, according to Shakespeare, most of the activities of people are geared to getting their own power. Brutus wanted to serve the ideal, but Brutus was crushed by the machinations of others. Now, Julius Caesar wraps this play up by vindicating the ideal, by vindicating Julius Caesar and thereby protecting the monarch of England in their day, that they are a fixed position and that we should be obedient to them. Because after his death, we know that the conspirators Cassius and Brutus, they join an army together, they fight against Octavius and Mark Antony, and they lose. Both of them commit suicide. But just listen to what they say when they commit suicide. Cassius says, Caesar, thou art revenged, even with the sword that killed thee. So, Cassius has someone kill him with his own sword, the same sword that killed Julius Caesar. Shakespeare is giving us a poetic justice. The very sword Cassius, the envious Cassius, murdered Caesar with, has turned back on him. It's as if Caesar's ghost is alive and has sought revenge, showing that actually Julius Caesar in the play was noble, was upright, was not guilty of anything bad, and lived for the people. Of Brutus, it said, Caesar, now be still. I killed not thee with half so good a will. Caesar, be still. He's saying the ghost of Caesar is alive and is avenging himself because of Brutus' treason against him as a best friend. And then he acknowledges that my reason for killing you was not anywhere near as justified as the nobility of killing myself, taking my own life. So he realizes he made a big mistake and that he was wrong to go against Caesar. But he'd been manipulated into that position. And right at the end, to show that Brutus is the tragic hero, that his nobility, which seems good, is what ultimately caused his downfall, hamartia, Mark Antony walks in and finds the body of Brutus just killed himself, and Mark Antony says, this was the noblest Roman of them all. All the conspirators, save only he, did that they did in envy of great Caesar. He only, in a general honest thought, and common good to all made one of them. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, "This was a man." Brutus did things out of good motive, but he'd been played. Mark Antony, or Julius Caesar, out of Mark Antony's own words, who is a survivor, calls Brutus the most noble, not Mark Antony, who stood by Caesar, because Mark Antony had his own reasons for doing things. So that is Julius Caesar, the play, in a nutshell. It's a play of personalities, power, and persuasion. The personality of Cassius, envious, dark, greedy for power. And he will break down a good character, Brutus, and the ideal of Julius Caesar in order to put himself in the dominant position. Brutus, a noble personality in the halls of power. Nobility is too innocent to exist there and can be bent to the will of the schemers. Mark Antony, he wants revenge and he is ambitious. He would come within a whisker of becoming emperor himself. And how did he do it? He used an appeal to the emotions and to the perfect ideal. He portrayed himself as standing for what is good and that he would avenge Caesar. He did it in order to win the support of the plebs, which makes him powerful. And the plebs go along with it through the whole book. They are moving back and forth in their opinions because they are unthinking. In fact, Casca, speaking to Cassius, says that they raise their stenching voice. It shows how those in power viewed the plebs. They were merely a pawn to get power. But their personal view of them was that they were stinking idiots, thick. And that's in the play. Do you know, we today are manipulated as much as the plebs are. When you state your opinion, let me ask you a question. How much of it is because the news said so, or because a teacher said so, or because a scientist said so, without actually doing any digging ourselves? When we do that, we're the plebs. And Shakespeare's saying, you really shouldn't trust people as much as that, because they probably have their own agendas. Julius Caesar is as relevant today as it was 400 years ago. And that's why Shakespeare's works last so long. He has a miraculous gift of seeing the real human behind the facade.